Principal of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus, Dr. Rhoda Reddock. Put your hands together and welcome Dr. Reddock.
Good morning, everyone, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I must acknowledge the Honorable Clifton Dekoto, Minister of Gender, Youth, and Child Development, Senator the Honorable Razia Ahmed, Minister of State in the Ministry of Gender, Youth, and Child Development, Mr. Richard Blewett, United Nations Resident Coordinator, Ms. Kinsan Diluin, UNICEF representative for the Eastern Caribbean, members of the Break the Silence Network, some members of whom I've seen here, Ms. Diana Mahabir Wyatt, Chair of the Child Protection Task Force, and members of the task force, Ms. Brenda Gopi, Child Development Special Envoy of the Ministry of Gender, Youth, and Child Development on Women and Gender Equity, representatives of the Children's Authority, representatives of government ministries, the United Nations system, civil society organizations, faith-based organizations, and other NGOs, representatives of related ministries, all specially invited guests, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and all other protocols having already been established. Good morning once again, and it is a pleasure for me to be here. We at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies are pleased to be part of this national launch, and we thank and acknowledge the work of the Ministry of Gender, Youth, and Child Development and UNICEF, and welcome their commitment to taking this campaign forward. There is so much that a university can do, and we also feel that the campaign needs to be taken to a national level. So we are really pleased to be here this morning to contribute and be part of this process. This is a summary, an overview of the presentation, and I now move into the introduction and background. Child sexual abuse, or what is normally referred to in the academic literature as intrafamilial sexual violence, is significant not only as a violation of the personal integrity of young women, boys, and girls, but also because it has been shown to enhance the risk of HIV infection and also other adverse physiological and psychological outcomes. And here I'd really like to draw your attention to this handout that was circulated in your package, which lists some of the emotional, physical, relational, and sexual outcomes of child sexual abuse. So although in its various forms it is criminalized, until recently there's been little critical academic examination of the underlying factors, be they gendered, cultural, sexual, or economic, or otherwise, which contribute to its existence in this region. Between 2006 and 2012, two major studies were carried out, both of them supported by UNICEF. The first was carried out in the Eastern Caribbean, and it was a very different study from our study here in Trinidad and Tobago. That was by Dr. Adele Jones, formerly of the University of the West Indies Social Work Program, and a number of her colleagues, which is now published in a volume entitled Understanding Child Sexual Abuse, Perspectives from the Caribbean. The second initiative was Breaking the Silence, a multisectoral research project to end child sexual abuse, which began around 2008. And this was carried out only in Trinidad and Tobago and was supported by the United Nations Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women, UNICEF, as well as the University of the West Indies, Government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago Research Development Fund. Emerging from the BTS project was the Break the Silence campaign, which was started in Trinidad and Tobago, but now has been taken up by UNICEF and the Unite campaign and Secretary General of the United Nations, and is being extended to the entire Caribbean region, and we are very pleased. The theme was gender and sexuality and the implications for HIV. We called together a group of stakeholders, probably similar to this morning's group, And we asked, what are the issues that you think we should be exploring? And emerging from that group of practitioners, both from the state sector, the NGO, the women's movement, etc., the issue of incest came up. We were told that they found this was prevalent throughout Trinidad and Tobago. In many instances, it was accepted or at least unremarked upon. It was felt by all that as this was a form of sexual activity, it was something that the HIV environment had not addressed, and that in a context of unequal power relations, there could be implications. And it was therefore felt that we needed to understand how this was understood, by the community, how it was rationalized, and the meanings that were attached to it, so that we could develop clear protocols and policies to address this issue. It should be noted that at this time, there was very little public discussion of these issues. While for years there had been problems of underreporting, there was no doubt that child sexual abuse was rampant in Trinidad and Tobago. Since 1991, at least 10% of the reports to the Rape Crisis Society in Trinidad and Tobago consistently dealt with incest, which was defined as intercourse between children and biological or step relatives. And this was quite a narrow definition. So reports of sexual abuse overall to the Rape Crisis Society have increased since 2004, which the organization attributes to the increased media coverage of the topic and the public education about the importance of speaking out about it that had begun to take place since that time. And since the start of this project and the campaign, I think reports have increased exponentially, and in fact, we have noted that there have been much more cases being brought to the court and many more charges being laid and persons found guilty. In one 6-month period in 2006, some 165 cases were reported to the police, of which 85% related to violations of girls and 16% were cases of incest. According to the Rape Crisis Society 2008 annual report, 42% of the clients were under the age of 17 and 67% under the age of 27. Now, those are their clients more generally. And as late as March 2013, Margaret Sampson Brown, head of the Victim and Witness Support Unit of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, reported that there have been over 200 reported cases of incest, rape, and sexual abuse for this year in central Trinidad alone. We have had about 800 clients coming to us from Central, Chaguanas, Couva, and those outlying areas. While childhood incest occurs among children of both sexes, the existing literature suggests that it is more prevalent among females. And in the Caribbean, we have observed not only biological fathers with their daughters, but also stepfathers with female children of their spouses, as well as other non-relatives and family members. To introduce this project, Breaking the Silence, and there you see the full title, was an action research project in that it aimed not only to get data, but also to influence and to contribute to some sort of change. It was carried out between 2008 and 2011, and as you already heard, it was part of a wider research project. Now, the key research question was, how do we understand ethnographically the sociocultural and gendered meanings associated with child sexual abuse and childhood incest within the sexual cultures in Trinidad and Tobago? In other words, we were not interested in who was guilty, who was not guilty, who were the bad people or who were the good people. We were trying to understand how our societies manage this experience. How do they relate to people who are perpetrators in the community? Were they ostracized? Did life continue? How did mothers and children, how were we dealing with this phenomena? We also hoped to sensitize stakeholders to the gendered, sociocultural, and psychosocial issues underlying this phenomena. We also hoped to develop multidisciplinary and community-based interventions for the empowerment of women, children of both sexes, and men in addressing childhood incest and in the prevention and treatment of HIV. And in collaboration with stakeholders, we also wanted to make recommendations for the development of new protocols, policies, and strategies. I should mention here 2 key stakeholders that worked with us during this initiative. One was the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and also Childline, which you will see recorded on a lot of our promotional activity. And I would like to thank them and acknowledge their contribution to this initiative. What were some of the components of this action research initiative? And in fact, we have developed a model which we will provide information on later on. We had national and community stakeholder meetings. We carried out a legislative review of the draft children's bills, as well as other existing legislation. This was carried out by Ms. Gayatri Paragas, and we were very happy to be able to forward that review to the Ministry of the Attorney General, and we understand that these data were considered in the redrafting of the children's bills. We also carried out a study of service providers from state sector, faith-based organizations, other community organizations that work with children to find out what systems existed and what those service providers felt were some of the issues involved. We then zeroed in on 3 communities, 2 in Trinidad and 1 in Tobago, for more in-depth action. And prior to that in-depth action, we did ethnographic case studies in each community. Then we did 1 year of community-directed interventions, policy roundtables when we had our findings, a regional conference, and our communications campaign. As I mentioned before, this study did not focus on prevalence or on individual case studies. We did want to do a study on prevalence, but in the end, because of the vastness of what we already were engaged in, we had to decide to put off a study on prevalence to a later date. As I mentioned, we developed a model which we have now written up and which we have submitted to UNICEF, but which is also involved in a paper that is going to be published shortly in the Journal of Child Sexual Abuse. But I think what is really important in this model is that we worked through community liaison teams. And in fact, when we entered the communities, we had one idea of what we wanted to do, but the community said, no, we don't want that. So what we decided to do was to develop specific interventions based on the ideas and recommendations of the community liaison teams. The interventions that we did were under 3 main headings: skills building, popular education and sensitization, and service provision. And some of the activities involved workshops with teachers, workshops with students, parenting workshops, support groups for adult survivors, theater in education, activities, and I see here members of Arts in Action who collaborated with us on those theater in education activities, as well as the spoken word, poetry programs, cottage meetings, invisible theater, etc. What is interesting is that at each of these interventions, we had note takers who documented the entire intervention as well as the information that came from those discussions. And that became the data that we derived from this research research activity. So it was a very innovative approach in that we never asked anybody, have you been abused? We didn't, that was not the methodology that was used. Now that probably would have been another methodology, but that's not what we would use. And what was also important is that evaluations did not come at the end. The evaluations were integrated throughout the entire exercise every activity had an evaluation. And then at the end, we did do a comprehensive evaluation. This morning, I cannot give you detailed findings. I just wanted to give a brief summary of some of the key findings. First of all, we found that sexual relations between older men and young, what in the communities they refer to as underage girls, were considered common. Importantly, and I think this was our most important finding, we found that females were expected to control the naturally, quote-unquote, aggressive sexuality of the men in their communities and protect their children. We noted also that a lack of blood connection often justified abuse, sexual abuse by stepfathers. As one respondent said, stepfathers think that because they are not biological, then they can have sex. We also found that in the area of consent, the onus is not on the men to refuse, but on women and girls to be not available. This was very interesting. There was also a stated awareness by the boys that they too could be victims from male perpetrators, but there was a resistance to discussing this. Now, in relation to sexual relations with older women, generally, the adults do not view boys' sexual relations with older women as abuse. As one male respondent noted, that is batin practice. Other key findings, that gender ideology shape both men's and women's attitudes to and responses to child sexual abuse. This is why it's so useful that this ministry includes gender, youth, and child development, something that this initiative or this issue is uniquely related to all of those. We also found that support systems to address this were virtually non-existent. I'm not sure if this has changed since our study. At the time of this study, I'm not sure if the children's bills have changed this, minors could not report abuse without an adult present. There was also a lack of safe spaces for child survivors, and also there was an absence of sexuality education and gender sensitization, which meant that women and girls, boys and girls, were not empowered to respond appropriately. They did not have the tools to analyze and to understand what was taking place, and therefore to make judgments on how they should respond. Now, this is just a summary of some of the gender ideologies related to child sexual abuse and incest that we found. First of all, we found that there were certain sexual rites of passage that male caregivers felt they were entitled. As one man put very succinctly, "I'm not feeding any cow for anyone else to drink milk from." There was also an acceptance that young girls could be sexually active. This was a statement from one group of men, but we found that this statement or similar ones existed throughout the society. After 8 is breakfast, after 9 is mine, after 12 is lunch. There was another one that we also got, after 10 is break. What we also found that refusing sex that appears to be available is a sign of homosexuality. So in our sexual cultures, it becomes difficult to men to refuse sex or to refuse what appears to be available sex, or else they would be considered homosexual. As one man said, men cannot refuse sex or else they would be considered funny. And also we found that substance use also was a factor contributing to child sexual abuse. And as one male reported, a man who does not drink rum is a manicu man, again suggesting that notions of masculinity affect these gendered and sexual relations. Moving on to the campaign. I think that one of the positive things about UNICEF as an agency is their openness to the use of media and to broad campaigns. And therefore, we were supported in this effort. The aim of the campaign was to decrease stigma and to raise awareness, to encourage policymakers to move to action. And the blue teddy symbol, from the very beginning, we were looking for a symbol for the campaign. And we hope that this symbol could become regional and global with the same power as the HIV/AIDS and breast cancer ribbons. In other words, we hope that someday, just seeing that symbol would give the message, end child sexual abuse, without us even having to say it. The symbol of the blue teddy bear with the plaster over the heart was developed by Kenneth Scott and Catherine Chan. Catherine is a member of staff of the IGDS. She's an artist and also was the media and communications consultant to the project. And Kenneth Scott and Catherine described the symbol in these words. The symbol of the blue teddy bear came to symbolize security, love, care, comfort, and relationships. The plaster across its heart was designed to offer a sense of hope and healing. Blue underlines the popular idiom of feeling blue, or feelings of hurt, sadness, and despair. And coming out of this, we had what has been a very interactive campaign. There we see some young persons painting some of our banners at one of our workshops. This is another young woman painting her blue teddy. This is a banner put up in Tobago. I think, and you see a sign there, Bethel Police Youth Club supports the Break the Silence, End Child Sexual Abuse Tobago campaign, call to action, Friday, 8th November. This is a young man who is doing some chalk drawings, that's 2011 on the ground. And then this was another section where we put these blank teddies and people were supposed to write their thoughts and reflections. And then we also have an online presence. We have a BTS Facebook causes page, and there's no wireless here, else I would have taken you to that page. Our IGDS, BTS homepage, and also this is our Facebook page. You see there former Senator Diana Mahabir-Wyatt of the coalition, and there's some young children at one of the marches. One of the groups that we worked with very actively was a group called Random Acts of Good Deeds. Then we spread the campaign nationally because, first of all, we participated in the Justice for Children March, and then other communities on their own initiative organized their own marches. And here we see Roy and Gloria, who voluntarily came to almost every march to lend their voice to the campaign. We had signs and billboards. We had wall paintings where organizations lent their walls for persons to write messages. Schools agreed to put up their own walls. Some of the other project outputs which are available for persons who want to take the campaign forward are the report of the project, the literature review on child sexual abuse in the Caribbean, the legislative review. We developed 5 policy briefs with recommendations coming out of the research, one on gender, one on education, one on HIV and child sexual abuse, one on service delivery, one on legislation. We also developed draft protocols in collaboration with service providers, and coming out of our study, we also have the BTS posters and postcards with information on the impact on service providers. We have a full-length documentary film with an educational booklet, 13 webisodes, a 4-minute video. They're all online. And we've also developed a radio soap opera with the Toco community. We hope to eventually get sponsorship to air it on Radio Toco as well as other radio stations. And of course, as being academics, we have academic papers and one poster that was presented to the UNAIDS conference in 2010 or 2011. A few preliminary recommendations. We would like to recommend the incorporation of gender and sexuality education in teacher and social work education programs at minimum, but of course we'd like to see it in all education programs. parenting programs and health and family life education programs must include issues of gender and sexuality. We want to recommend work with men generally on gender and sexuality, but which we should focus on the need for men to take responsibility for their sexual actions and decision-making. And we would like to see strengthened social intervention programs and support programs at all levels of society, because I think our communities, our families, and our children really need a robust social intervention program. We recommend psychosocial support for all survivors, that young women and men must be empowered to be independent in their decision-making. Homophobia must be addressed, as this contributes to extremes of masculine behavior, for example, hyper-heterosexuality in order to prove one's masculinity, and parents and households must be supported to meet the challenges of 21st century parenting. And I would like to say that the UWI and the Institute for Gender and Development Studies stands ready to work with the Ministry of Gender, Youth and Child Development, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Social Development, and all other agencies to facilitate the implementation of these recommendations. In conclusion, I would like to say the social context for child sexual abuse in the Caribbean involves several interconnecting factors, such as gender inequality, social norms based on patriarchal values, domestic violence, the economic dependence of many women and men on men and the status of children. The meanings attached to masculinity and femininity, for instance, have implications for child sexual abuse, as they shape how girls and boys experience their bodies, their sexuality, and their sexual rights. And these ideas also shape the kinds of power to which they have access and to which they are especially vulnerable. Where do we go from here? Through the work of UNICEF and the UN system, this campaign has been expanded at a sub-regional level. You've already heard that launches such as this have taken place elsewhere. And in Trinidad and Tobago, the campaign will now be taken to another level through the work of the Ministry, Youth and Child Development with the support of UNICEF. With the support of UNICEF, the IGDS will collaborate with the ministry in hosting a program of capacity building exercises for civil society organizations, the media, police, and judicial officers. And we look forward to working with all of you in addressing this critical but complex national challenge. And in closing, I want to leave this thought and question. In an increasingly sexualized world, how are issues of power, pleasure, and social justice to be reconciled? Thank you very much.